Picture this. You re a 10-year-old girl playing with your dolls in the courtyard of your family's home in ancient Rome. The morning sun filters through the columns as your mother hums while weaving nearby. Your father discusses business with visiting clients. It's an ordinary day in 57 BCE until the sound of ceremonial horns echoes through your neighborhood. The Pontifex Maximus has arrived to make his selection. You watched from behind your mother's robes as the highest priest in Rome examines the gathered children. His eyes scan each face with clinical precision. When his gaze falls upon you, time stops. He raises his staff and speaks the words that will destroy your childhood forever. This one serves Vesta. Your mother collapses to her knees, weeping. Your father stands frozen, knowing that refusing means death for the entire family. You don't understand why everyone is crying. You've just been chosen for the highest honor a Roman girl can receive. What you don't realize is that you've been sentenced to 30 years of sacred terror, followed by punishments so horrific that death would seem merciful. Before diving into these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we re-exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Today, we're going to uncover the 3 most horrific punishments that awaited Rome's vestal virgins. What you about to hear isn't taught in any classroom because the reality was too disturbing for sanitized history books. These weren't just religious ceremonies gone wrong. They were systematic torture methods designed to control women through fear, disguised as divine justice. The selection of a vestal virgin wasn't an honor. It was a kidnapping sanctioned by the state and blessed by the gods. The requirements were specific and chilling. The candidate had to be between 6 and 10 years old, with both parents alive, born of Roman citizens, and free from any physical defect. She needed to be the product of a legally valid marriage, symbolically perfect in every way. But here's what most people don't realize about this selection process. Families actively hid their daughters when the Pontifex Maximus made his rounds. They would send girls to relatives in distant provinces, claim sudden illnesses, or even temporarily disfigure them with cosmetics to make them unsuitable. The selection wasn't celebrated. It was feared when a girl was chosen. The transformation began immediately. She was taken from her family that same day, never to return home again. Her birth name was erased and replaced with a title that marked her as property of the goddess Vesta. She couldn't inherit from her family, couldn't own property in her own name, and couldn't even write letters without supervision. The house of vessels where she would live for 3 decades was described by ancient writers as the most beautiful prison ever built. Located in the Roman Forum adjacent to the Temple of Vesta, it featured marble columns, ornate gardens, and luxurious furnishings. But luxury couldn't disguise the reality that she was now a prisoner whose every movement was monitored by senior vessels and priests. Her education began with learning the 3 sacred laws that would govern every moment of her remaining life. First, perpetual virginity for 30 years with no possibility of marriage or physical intimacy. Second, absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and senior religious authorities. Third, constant guardianship of the sacred flame that supposedly kept Rome itself alive. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were laws backed by punishments that made Roman crucifixions look humane. The young girl learned that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to Rome, and Rome had very specific ideas about what happened to women who failed in their duties. The vessel was told that she was sacred, chosen by the gods, blessed above all other women in the empire. What they didn't tell her was that this sacred status made her punishments even more brutal. Because she was holy, she couldn't be executed like a common criminal. Instead, Rome had developed specialized torture methods that preserved her sanctity while destroying her humanity. Ancient sources describe new vessels weeping for months after their selection, begging to return home, refusing to eat until forced senior vessels would tell them that resistance was futile, that the goddess had chosen them, and that their suffering was part of their sacred duty. But the real message was simpler and more terrifying. You belong to us now, forever. The psychological conditioning was systematic and complete. The girl learned that her worth as a person depended entirely on her performance as a vessel. Any mistake, any moment of doubt, Any sign of human weakness could trigger punishment that would make her long for death. But death wasn't allowed. She was too sacred to kill and too valuable to release. This sacred status became the foundation for punishments so creative in their cruelty that they've been studied by modern psychologists as examples of institutionalized psychological warfare. Rome had perfected the art of destroying a person's spirit while keeping their body alive to continue suffering. If you thought being selected as a vestal virgin was the worst part of the story, you haven't heard about what happened when they made their first mistake. The sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta was supposed to burn eternally, representing Rome's divine protection and eternal existence. If that flame ever went out, it wasn't just considered a religious failure. It was treated as an act of treason against the Roman state. When the flame died, the investigation began immediately. The Pontifex Maximus would interrogate each vestal individually, searching for signs of negligence, distraction, or moral corruption that might have caused this catastrophe. The questioning could last for days, with the suspect isolated in a windowless chamber beneath the temple, deprived of food and sleep until she confessed to some failing. But confession was just the beginning. The punishment was called the verbal ratio, and it took place in absolute darkness in the depths of the temple complex. The condemned vestal would be stripped naked and bound to a wooden frame designed specifically for this purpose. The Pontifex Maximus himself would administer the beating using consecrated rods that had been blessed. In Vestal's name, the beating wasn't random violence. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to inflict maximum pain while preserving the vestal's sacred status. She couldn't be allowed to scream because her voice was considered holy. A leather gag would be placed in her mouth, muffling any sounds of agony. She couldn't be allowed to bleed visibly because her blood was consecrated. The rods were designed to cause internal bruising and organ damage without breaking the skin. Ancient medical texts describe vessels who died days later from internal injuries sustained or verbal ratio. But the official cause of death was always listed as sudden illness or divine displeasure, never as punishment-related injuries. The beatings were conducted in such secrecy that most Romans never knew they occurred. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical torture. The vestal never knew when the next flame inspection would occur. She lived in constant terror that a draft might extinguish the fire, or that her attention might wander for just a moment. This chronic fear created what modern psychologists would recognize as severe anxiety disorders that manifested in physical symptoms throughout her body. Historical records describe vessels who developed tremors, lost their hair from stress, and aged decades. In the span of months following their first verbal ratio, the trauma wasn't just physical. It was a systematic destruction of their sense of safety and self-worth that made them more compliant for future decades of service. But the most insidious aspect of this punishment was its randomness. The sacred flame could die from natural causes or completely beyond any vessel's control. A sudden wind, a structural problem with the temple, or even sabotage by enemies could extinguish it. But responsibility always fell on the vessels, and punishment was always inevitable. Some historical accounts suggest that the flame was deliberately extinguished by authorities who wanted to punish particular vessels for political reasons or personal grudges. The religious pretext gave them perfect cover for what was essentially state-sanctioned torture of defenseless women. The recovery process was deliberately prolonged to maximize psychological impact. The injured vestal would be tended by temple physicians who had been instructed to provide minimal care, ensuring that her recovery was slow and painful. She would be reminded daily that her suffering was deserved, that she had failed in her sacred duty, and that only perfect service going forward might prevent future punishment. This created a cycle of trauma and compliance that lasted for decades. Vessels who survived verbal ratio became completely subservient, terrified of showing any sign of independence or individuality that might trigger another round of punishment. They transformed from human beings into hollow shells that performed their duties with mechanical precision while their spirits slowly died inside. If you think ritualized beatings were Rome's most creative form of cruelty, you haven't heard about their solution for vessels accused of the ultimate transgression. The charge was called insistum, meaning pollution or defilement, and it referred to any suspected violation of a vessel's vow of chastity. The punishment for incest then wasn't execution, it was something far worse. The case of Otmir in Florentia in 216 BCE provides the most detailed account of this horror. According to the historian Livy, Both women were accused of breaking their vows of chastity based on nothing more than gossip and political rivalry. Their trial, if it can be called that, was conducted in complete secrecy by the College of Pontiffs. No defense was permitted. No evidence was required beyond accusations from anonymous sources. When the verdict was announced, the condemned vestal was told she would be returned to the earth, from which all life springs. This poetic language disguised a punishment so horrific that it defied human comprehension. The ritual began at dawn with a procession through the Ramang Forum. The condemned vestal was dressed in a white bridal gown, her hair arranged in the style of a new bride, flowers woven into her veil. To observers who didn't know the truth, she might have looked like she was going to her wedding. In a sense, she was being married to death. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Rome, allowing citizens to witness what happened to women who defied sacred law. But the vestal wasn't allowed to speak, to cry, or to show any emotion. Her mouth was sealed with wax to prevent any final words that might create sympathy among the crowd. The destination was the campus, sclerotic, the field of the wicked located just outside the city walls. Their workers had spent days preparing her final resting place. A chamber had been carved into the earth, accessed by a narrow staircase that would be sealed forever. Once she descended inside the underground chamber, Rome demonstrated its twisted sense of mercy. A bed was provided along with a small lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a cup of milk. The official justification was that Rome wasn't executing the vestal. They were simply placing her in isolation and allowing the guards to determine her fate. The food and water proved they weren't committing murder. This was legal fiction at its most cruel. The provisions were calculated to last exactly long enough to maximize her suffering. The lamp had oil for perhaps 6 hours. The food and water might sustain her for 2 or 3 days, but the air in the sealed chamber would run out long before the food did. The descent into the chamber was choreographed to maximize psychological torture. The vestal had to walk down the stairs herself. She couldn't be carried or forced because that would make Rome responsible for her death. She had to participate in her own burial, making the final choice to enter the chamber that would become her tomb. Once she reached the bottom, the staircase was quickly dismantled. Workers filled in the opening with earth and stones, packing it so tightly that no sound could escape. The surface was smoothed and marked only with a small stone that bore no inscription. Within hours, no visible trace remained of what had occurred there. Ancient sources describe what happened next in clinical detail that makes the horror even more unbearable. The condemned vestal would have several hours of lamplight to contemplate her situation. She could see the food and water, could calculate exactly how long her torment would last. She could hear her own breathing getting harder as the oxygen slowly depleted. Some historical accounts mention scratching sounds heard from underground in the days following these burials. Workers reported strange noises coming from the earth near burial sites. Sounds that might have been fingernails clawing at stone, walls or wooden planks scraping against dirt as the victim tried desperately to escape. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the complete silence that followed. The victim's name was erased from all public records. Her family was forbidden to mourn her or even speak her name. She didn't just die. She was retroactively removed from existence, as if she had never been born. This erasure was so complete that modern historians struggle to identify victims of living burial because their names were systematically removed from surviving documents. We know the practice occurred regularly over centuries, but the victims became nameless. Shadows lost to historical memory. The legal justification remained the same throughout Roman history, because the vestal entered the chamber voluntarily, because food and water were provided, because no Roman citizen directly killed her. This wasn't considered execution. It was simply divine judgment expressed through natural consequences. After 30 years of service, surviving vessels were theoretically free to leave temple life and reintegrate into Roman society. They received ceremonies honoring their decades of faithful service, financial rewards from the imperial treasury, and official permission to marry and start families. This sounds like a happy ending to a difficult life. But the reality was far more sinister. Consider the mathematics of this freedom. A woman selected at age 8 would be released at 38, in an era when most Roman women married in their teens and began bearing children immediately. A 38-year-old woman was considered past her childbearing prime and largely unmanageable. The freedom to marry was meaningless when no one wanted to marry you. But the social obstacles were even more brutal than biological ones. Romans believed that a woman who had spent 3 decades in sacred service was fundamentally different from normal women. She had been touched by divine forces in ways that made her unsuitable for ordinary human relationships. Men feared that marrying a former vestal would bring divine retribution, or that her years of enforced celibacy had somehow corrupted her ability to be a proper wife. The case of Claudia Quinta illustrates this cruel reality. After completing her service in 43 CE, she was granted a substantial dowry and introduced to several potential husbands from respectable families. But each engagement was broken when the men's families consulted religious authorities who declared that marrying a former vestal would pollute their bloodlines and anger the gods. Claudia spent her remaining 20 years living alone in a small house outside Rome, shunned by the society she had served faithfully. She never married, never had children, and died in complete isolation. Her funeral was attended by no one except hired mourners, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. The financial rewards promised to former vessels often failed to materialize due to bureaucratic obstacles and legal technicalities. Many discovered that their promised pensions had been reduced or eliminated entirely during their decades of service. They emerged from temple life not just socially isolated, but economically desperate, with no family support system and no practical skills for earning a living. The psychological damage from 3 decades of institutionalized trauma created additional barriers to normal life. Former vessels frequently suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced panic attacks, paranoid episodes, and difficulty forming normal human relationships. After years of emotional suppression and social isolation, historical accounts describe former vessels who would wake screaming from nightmares about the sacred flame going out, who compulsively checked and rechecked locks on their doors, who couldn't bear to be touched by another human being. Their minds had been so thoroughly conditioned by fear and isolation that freedom felt more terrifying than captivity. Some attempted suicide rather than faced life outside the temple. Others retreated into complete hermitage, recreating their temple isolation in private homes where they lived like ghosts of their former selves. A few tried desperately to reintegrate into society but found themselves completely unprepared for basic social interactions. After decades of ritualized behavior, the most tragic cases involved former vessels who developed what historians called sacred madness. They would wander through Rome, claiming to receive visions from Vesta, preaching to crowds about divine revelations and performing bizarre rituals in public spaces. Roman authorities usually ignored these displays, treating the women as harmless lunatics rather than addressing the systematic trauma that had created their conditions. Perhaps most cruelly, some former vessels were recruited back into temple service as advisors or supervisors, perpetuating the cycle of abuse by training new generations of victims. Having survived their own torture, they became complicit in inflicting the same suffering on younger women, creating an institutional memory that preserved these brutal practices for centuries. The promise of freedom after 30 years of service was revealed as the cruelest deception of all. These women had sacrificed their youth, their fertility, their families, and their sanity for Rome. In return, they received social exile, economic abandonment, and psychological destruction that lasted until their deaths. The treatment of vestal virgins reveals the sophisticated cruelty that Rome could disguise as religious devotion. These women weren't just victims of individual sadists or corrupt officials. They were casualties of a systematic program designed to control female autonomy through institutionalized terror. Modern psychological analysis of historical accounts suggests that the Vestal Virgin system was essentially a centuries-long experiment in trauma-based social control by taking girls at their most vulnerable age, isolating them from normal human development, and subjecting them to unpredictable punishment and reward cycles. Rome created a class of women who were completely dependent on institutional approval for survival. The 3 punishments we've explored represent escalating levels of dehumanization. The ritual beatings destroyed their sense of physical safety, living burial eliminated. Their hope for future freedom and the false promise of eventual liberation crushed their spirits entirely by revealing that even faithful service led only to abandonment and exile. What makes this system particularly horrific is how completely it was normalized within Roman society. Citizens who would have been outraged by similar treatment of male slaves accepted the torture of Vestal, Virgins as necessary for maintaining divine favor and social order. The religious justification made the cruelty invisible to most contemporaries and historians. The legacy of these practices extends far beyond ancient Rome. The systematic use of sexual purity as a tool for social control. The institutionalization of violence against women within religious frameworks and the psychological manipulation of victims into accepting their own oppression can be found throughout history and continue in various forms today. These forgotten women deserve to be remembered not as symbols of Roman piety, but as human beings who endured unimaginable suffering in service to an empire that valued their compliance more than their humanity. Their stories remind us that the most dangerous tyrannies are often those that wrap themselves in sacred justification and claim divine authority for human cruelty. If you found this exploration of hidden history as compelling as I did, make sure to subscribe for more content that uncovers the disturbing truths behind historical myths. And comment below to let me know what other dark chapters of the past you'd like to see explored. There are so many more buried stories waiting to be told. Remember that these women lived, suffered, and died as real human beings, not as footnotes to imperial glory. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their individual courage, but our obligation to recognize and resist institutionalized cruelty wherever it appears.